Hey guys, Drifter here. I have something of a more serious commentary for you today about guns in the United States. This is part one of a three-part series. I'm going to call it a mini-series of commentaries about guns in the United States. Part one, we're going to be talking about the history of the gun culture in the United States, our legal precedents, and reasons that we own guns, as in good reasons to own weapons. So this would be the sort of pro-gun episode. Number two, which is going to come out in a couple of days, is going to be a three-person discussion between myself, JX23, who's from the United Kingdom, and Sergeant Merrill, who is a pro-gun control, former Army Ranger, and gun owner. I thought that would be an interesting mix, and that one's going to be the anti-gun, or reasons not to own weapons. And the final part, part three, is going to be a more objective video where I discuss the relationship between weapons and crime. Do weapons increase crime? Does increase of weapons cause increase in violent crime? That sort of thing. But for today, we're just going to stick with the good reasons to own guns and history of gun culture in the United States. The links to those other two will be available in the description as they go live. The gameplay that you're going to see today is probably just going to be Black Ops 2. That's the game that I play the most, and it's the most convenient for me to get clips from. I kind of had this crazy idea when starting this that maybe I should get clips using only weapons that I can legally buy here in the United States. And I live in Texas too, so the gun laws are pretty lax. And I started playing a few games with the semi-automatic weapons, then it finally hit me, oh wait, I can buy pretty much anything here. As long as I go through the licensing process and fill out all my paperwork, there's pretty much no gun in a Call of Duty game that I cannot buy or at least rent or have some limited degree of access to. So I'm just going to use whatever it is that I feel like using. The gameplay is fairly normal. So without wasting any more of your time, let's skip into the actual discussion of the gun history in the United States. And in this video, you're going to notice some numbers popping up in the corner. When I discuss a fact that I feel needs to be cited, something that is greater than common sense, the little link is going to pop up a number, and in the description you'll find the a link to whatever it is that I said correlating to that number. So in case you don't believe me, there's some proof of it. Anyway, we're going to be talking about the fact that gun ownership is a core part of the American identity. For those of you that are overseas, your nation has been settled to some degree for a very, very long time. The land has not changed. It's been mapped. It's been known. There were no natives. You guys were the natives. In our country, in the United States, that was not necessarily the case. Up until maybe the last 100 to 150 years ago, there was a lot of unsettled territory, and this was a big frontier nation. There was colonialism. There was expansion, people pushing in against each other, but mostly it was barren country. It was unknown land. The Indians knew it fairly well, but the rest of us didn't, and because of that, guns were needed for hunting. We had to eat, we had to hunt, so we owned guns to hunt. Fairly simple thing there. But then guns were also needed for protection, not only from the Native Indians or Native Americans, because we didn't exactly treat them very nice, and they weren't always very nice to us. There was plenty of bad blood and bad relations, so people owned weapons to protect themselves from the natives, and they also owned weapons to protect themselves from bandits and from competing groups, because unlike other countries, you had, well, matter of fact, people from other countries would come and settle in the United States, so within a relatively small geographic area, you would have people of different languages, different religious preferences, different cultures, slightly, some, European, but it was much more varied than it is now. The European culture is kind of growing together a little bit over time as the world shrinks and our ability to communicate grows, but competition was very stout. There was a lot of banditry, there was a lot of robbing, there was no such thing as police, so you had to own a weapon to protect yourself. And again, this isn't 500-600 years ago. This is all the way up until about 200-ish years ago, around the time of the founding of our country, which was also another major part of our gun culture, and that's the fact that the Revolutionary War was fought to some degree with militias that used personal rifles. I know that we did have a standing army, we did have a formal army, we had a trained army. George Washington led that army, but we also had a lot of militiamen when we fought our war for independence against the British, which we call the Revolutionary War, and the British call a footnote in their grand history of conquest. But because of the strength of the militiamen, we were able to win the war, or at least they definitely helped. And because of that, which you'll see later, when we started writing our laws, we wrote in there some clauses about gun ownership in order to maintain these militias should they be needed again. As I mentioned earlier, our country was not settled until around the 1900s-ish, I would say about 1900, 1910, something like that. We had it fully mapped, mostly settled, and it wasn't a completely unknown territory anymore. But up until just around 100 years ago, there were places that people knew nothing about. They were still looking for El Dorado. There were unmapped places, unknown islands, unconquered territory, and it was a very violent, dangerous place, and you needed to have a gun. A gun wasn't an option. A gun was a necessity for survival, to defend yourself, to hunt, to make you look more threatening so that people wouldn't attack you. It was just something that you had to do, because otherwise you'd just be dead meat out there in the wilderness with no weapon. Because of all of these factors, the culture or ethos of our gun ownership still survives. We are not very many generations removed from the frontiermen and from the militiamen and from the people that had to fight each other in the Civil War as well. So if you think about it, your grandfather's grandfather isn't terribly far away down the family line. And generally speaking, people learn their lessons from their parents, and they grow up to be of a similar religion or political persuasion, or at least a large part of their personal beliefs are based on the beliefs of their parents. So you don't have to go very far down the line to see that we are not that far removed from this extreme frontier settling, colonialism, battle, civil war, cowboys versus Indians kind of culture. And there's also a factor going into place in that gun ownership in the United States of America is something of a coming-of-age story. You give a boy a rifle, you teach him how to use it. You take your children out to hunt. You teach your daughter how to defend herself with a handgun or a little Derringer pistol or something like that. And this coming of age, this transcending, is still there in our culture, even in big cities and stuff. Gun ownership is a part of growing up. And because of that, we do have a very strong gun culture in the United States. That is a short overview of the reasons that we have a gun culture in the United States and the origins of such things. It was a very, very fast overview, but each one of those topics I could talk days and days and days about, and I'm sure you guys don't want to hear that, and I have other things to talk about. We're going to skip into the legal precedents for gun ownership in the United States of America, and the thing that I need to talk about first in our legal precedents is the way that we set our system up, because very few people that live overseas understand this, and even not a lot of Americans really understand this. We have a negative powers constitution. President Obama recently received a lot of criticism because he described our Constitution as a negative document, and the press kind of ran with this and said, oh, he hates the Constitution, Obama wants to enslave us and things like this. What he was talking about is that in the legal sense, we have a negative powers constitution, and that sounds bad, but a negative powers constitution is one where we as the people grant the government the power. The power holder in this country is the people, legally anyway. That may have changed over time. But the people, the citizenry, hold all of the power in the country, and they grant the government specific powers. And we call this a negative power because anything that you do not give to the government, you retain for yourself, gun ownership being one of them. In a lot of other constitutions, various countries use this. No, we don't have a lot of negative power constitutions in the world. They have a positive powers constitution where the government holds the power and it grants rights to the citizens. It might be 400 rights, 300 rights, 20 rights. Those are the rights you have as a citizen, and everything else is retained by the government. Here in the United States, it's the other way around. You as the citizen grant the governments the power. Anything you don't give to the government is held by the citizens. And I think that's a very important thing to understand as we move forward about this, because it does relate to gun control. And in our Second Amendment right, which was the Second Amendment to the Constitution, it says, this is the supreme body of our land that you must obey because this is our Constitution of giving the government power. It says, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I should note that there are two different versions of this that have commas placed in different areas, and some people, lawyers and judges and Supreme Court judges, would argue that this changes the meaning of it. But if you read it very carefully, you'll notice that it's saying that a well-regulated militia is necessary to keeping a state free, and that's the reason that we own guns. And a lot of people would say that militia is to repel a foreign invasion, and that's true. That's completely true. One of the reasons that we own arms, or that we were originally decided to leave the right to own weapons in the hands of the citizenry, was so that we could maintain our old revolutionary militia, and such that if a foreign country were to invade us, that our citizenry would have the ability to fight back and defend themselves with firearms of any type. And this wasn't very specific. People owned lots and lots of crazy things. Obviously, a current firearms are not going to keep up with military technology. The citizenry could not fight against a foreign power, though it would make it very difficult for them to invade. Matter of fact, I remember a Japanese general in World War II, somebody interviewed him if the Japanese had ever considered invading mainland United States, and the general said that it would be a nightmare to do so because there would be a rifle behind behind every blade of grass, and that's the kind of deterrent we want. However, that's not the main reason that this is in there. If you read it more closely, you'll see that the right to bear arms has more to do with deterring or overthrowing a tyrannical government of our own than it does with anything else. So if we grant the government powers, and this was a document that was drafted by people that were upset with abuse of powers of government and went through great means, very, very great, laborious means to make sure that our government could not grow out of control or tyrannical or dictatorial or something like that, that the reason we own guns as citizens in the United States, the reason that we were given permission to do so, was so that we could prevent our own government from becoming a dictatorship or a theocracy or any of these sort of extreme forms of government. We hated tyrants at the time we were fighting. I believe it was King George, and we did not want another King George in power in our government. So the reason you as a citizen own a gun is so that you can kill the army when they come to get you, so that you can kill police officers that don't obey the law and slaughter government officials that are acting in a corrupt manner, in a tyrannical manner, or beyond their means of power. And I'm not saying this because I encourage you to do such things, and I know it sounds like a very bad thing to say, especially for police officers and government officials, but that was the number one reason that you were able to protect yourself, was to be able to protect yourself from the state. I'm going to move away from that topic a little bit before people get too upset about me encouraging shooting of government, and we're going to talk about some other reasons. Another big reason was self-defense. When this document was drafted, there wasn't really much of a police force, a lot of unsettled territory, and as we discussed earlier, you had to defend yourself. It was up to the man in the household, the head of the family, to defend himself, to teach his wife how to use a rifle, to teach his son how to use the rifle, because he had to protect himself against Indians, against bandits, against they did have corrupt government officials in the day, against his neighbor, against anybody that wanted to attack the land, because it was the wild, people say the wild, wild west was wild. Well, our whole country was at one point the wild, wild west. As mentioned before, there was very limited law enforcement in the founding of this country. So one of the other reasons that we owned weapons was that in small villages and more rural areas, the citizenry could partake in law enforcement duties. This, you're probably thinking about lynching and witch hunts and stuff like that, and that's very unfortunate because it did happen. But it did grant the citizenry some power to enforce their own laws where they couldn't afford a full police force. And interestingly enough, even though the reason we own firearms is so that we can overthrow our government, one of the reasons the people drafting the Constitution allowed this was also so that they could prevent a rebellion, because the militias at the time were not composed of, we'll say, well-intentioned men. Combat was brutal and rough, so you had a lot of crazy men, a lot of desperate men, a lot of bandits trying to escape punishment somewhere, and the militias were a dirty, rough bunch. And our Continental Congress was in some way worried that if the militias were not compensated enough, if they were not paid enough, if a very charismatic leader were to arise amongst them, that these militias, after they were done fighting the Revolutionary War, could overthrow our government while it was being founded and set up and that sort of stuff. So if all citizens owned weapons, then the citizens could form a counter-militia to our militia and destroy the militia. And that seems like a crazy thing to say, but it was a safeguard for the concerns at the time. Because of our legal system, where we value freedom and rights and abilities to do things more than we do our safety or statistics or probability, Americans tend to prefer a dangerous freedom over a safer limitation. Most of us are very paranoid about our freedoms being taken away or infringed upon by others, and we're going to talk about more of that in the gun crime episode, because that's a culture issue. We have a hyper-competitive culture that is composed of thousands of different subcultures, because there's no such thing as a typical American. You can go to any city in the United States and you will find people of every race, every culture, every religion, and every creed, and it's crazy, and they don't always get along. So because of that, most of us prefer to have the ability to protect ourselves rather than having somebody do it for us, even though protecting ourselves is dangerous and may or may not be causing crime. In the last part of this video, I would like to talk about some practical reasons that we as Americans own firearms, and these are reasons that are irrespective of history and of current law, just some good reasons to own a gun if you live in the United States. The number one reason is that we still have a lot of what I would call frontier territory that has very few people in it. It's very sparsely populated, and the only thing really there are animals. Some dangerous, some not so dangerous, but there are no people. You go out there and you could walk 100 miles, 50 miles, some places maybe even 200 miles in any direction and not find a single person. You mostly find this in Alaska. There are huge areas in Alaska that are just completely unpopulated. There's big areas in Texas and Montana, Arizona, surprisingly Louisiana as well. But when you go out there into this wilderness, it's just you and the woods. There's no emergency services, there's no police, there's no ambulance. Even if you somehow by the grace of God had cell phone signal out there, there's no way for anybody to come and get you. So you're just out there by yourself. And the reasons you need, one of the main reasons you need a weapon in this sort of situation is to protect yourself from animals. And the example that I like to give of this is when I was hunted by coyotes when I lived in Kentucky. Because when I lived in Kentucky, I lived on a relatively unpopulated section of land. We had a couple neighbors, but they were a few miles apart. Just a lot of people out there owned really huge patches of lands, very sparsely populated, like I was saying. And one day I just decided to take a walk because it was my land and I can walk around and enjoy the nature if I want to. And as I was walking about, it was, I would say, about an hour before sunset, I kept hearing these little noises on the left and on the right in the bushes, out in the woods just somewhere off beyond the walking trail. And I didn't think too much of it because there's always critters out there doing whatever it is that critters do. And I heard a slightly larger, slightly closer noise to my right. And I remember looking over and I saw the outline of what I thought was a dog. And it seemed to point its head at me and then run off further into the woods. And it concerned me a little bit, and I kept walking, and then I heard a howl off on my left. And it finally sunk in that all these noises that I'm hearing on the right and the left is a pack of coyotes, or maybe not a full pack, at least some of them, and that they were following me. And this was concerning because on that particular day, I had decided that there was no need to take a gun with me. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with coyotes. Think wild dogs, big wild dogs, nasty, rabies, they bite, they mangle you 4, 5, 6 at a time. Very dangerous situation. I don't know if they were following me because they were curious or because they were hungry, but I was concerned. So I had to pick up a big stick just in case and kind of double time it back to the house, and I could hear them following me more or less until I got within about a half to a quarter mile of the house, and then they kind of fettered off because they don't like coming near the house. And it was concerning, and after that I didn't go out without either a pistol or a shotgun or sometimes a sword or just a really big stick because it can be dangerous out in the woods. Coyotes are they're really not the most aggressive of creatures. You have wolves on occasion, again, not very aggressive, but there are wolverines, there are bears that you can stumble into, mountain lions, different things in different parts of the United States, crocodiles, alligators, not crocodiles, alligators. We have alligators in the United States. And you can get into trouble very, very quickly. Also, in these areas where there is sparse population, you have little to no police protection. If you call the police, it can take 45 minutes for an hour for them to show up. They don't show up quickly. Even if they could show up quickly, it's just not a possibility to protect all the land area that has no people living in it. Hell, sometimes even if you live in a big city and you call the police, they decide to take an hour to show up because it's dangerous in a city. The best example I have of this is when I was looking for places to film for the Fallout film about a year ago. That all fell through the ground. I found this ghost town. I believe it was a border town between Texas and New Mexico. It was up there in the Panhandle, and the town was more or less intact. It was one of those old Route 66 places that just totally crumbled into nothingness, and they had all these buildings, and it looked great for like a Fallout New Vegas kind of thing. And I called the local sheriff and some of the people that lived there, and they said that they didn't have a problem with me going out there, but that if I go out to this place, I need to be incredibly careful, and we need to bring some real guns and not just props. I'm like, what are you talking about? There's nothing out there. There's not even any animals out there. It's just desert and empty. And he said, no, you don't understand. It's a place that nobody goes. The police don't even go there. There's just a lot of drug traffic there. It's so empty that that's where all the criminals go to do whatever it is, all their meetings, all their drug trafficking. He says about once or twice a year I get a call to go out there and pick up a couple of dead bodies, or something's been blown up or something crazy has happened. We just go out there and clean up the mess, and that's it. He says every now and then we get calls about people that pick up hitchhikers that try and carjack people. They're just crazy stuff because there is no protection out there. And I discussed this over with the people that I was wanting to film with, and we decided that it wouldn't be a good thing to do because we couldn't guarantee our equipment wouldn't get stolen. We couldn't guarantee that we wouldn't stumble across a drug deal. We couldn't guarantee that we would even be able to protect ourselves because we weren't planning on bringing firearms. There's some rules about taking firearms across states. You're not really supposed to do that. And if you live in a place like this, if you live near a place like this, if your job requires you to travel through places like this, it's very good to have a firearm. You don't want to be out in a place like this where you're completely unable to protect yourself from people. And protection from people is another one of the good reasons that we own guns in this country. Same as protecting yourself in the empty places where it's just you and the bad guys should you end up in a situation like that. It can be true in some of the cities because some of the cities in the United States have extremely high crime rates. We have very high crime cities like Memphis, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore. They can be very, very dangerous places, well, in general, and they can also be dangerous, especially if you're at the wrong place at the wrong time. It's just not pretty. And I know every country and every place has bad crime, but because of the way we have our laws in the United States, a lot of these places you're allowed to conceal carry. So if you find yourself getting carjacked or being in the wrong alley at the wrong time, or somebody starts a bar fight or something crazy, you can pull a firearm to protect yourself. And most of these places do have laws that, at least in some way, allow you to protect yourself with firearms. I think Detroit actually might not. No, Chicago has pretty strict firearm laws about self-defense. But we have high crime rates, and it's important to protect yourself. The explanation I always get, it's better to be tried by 12 than carried by 4. I believe in that one. And the reason that some of these crime rates exist, we're going to talk about this more in the gun crime video, is that our country is radically diverse. And many of you that live overseas may think that your country is diverse. You may be living under the illusion of diversity because there's like 2 black people in your town or something like that. There's no such thing as an actual American. There's no such thing as an average American. You think of us as like the white guys that are rich, but the reality is only, I think, 60% of us are even white anymore. Our country is composed, and even when we were founded, we weren't just white in the sense that there's a general white here, but we were Dutch, we were French, we were English, Irish, German. They even had Nords and Scandinavians coming down. And because of that, we have radically different peoples coming in that are racially different. They have different religions. They have different cultures. They have different rules about money. They have different rules about family, different structures. And we don't think collectively. It's not like when people show up on the shores of the United States, poof, we all get this new culture and we all get along. They take all of that with us. Everybody competes here. Just the nature of this country and its capitalistic nature and the way our laws are and the way the frontier, everybody for himself kind of thing, we all compete. Everybody wants our culture to be the best, and everybody wants the way we do things to be the best. And some people take this to extremes, and we don't often collectively think of ourselves as neighbors or band together unless there's a foreign invader or like a greater enemy besides each other. And because of this, you need to be able to protect yourself because large groups of like-minded people can do crazy things. Just think about the lynchings in the South in the early 19th century. Black people were lynched basically just for being black. They'd get some sort of crimes tossed at them in a kangaroo court, and the police wouldn't even stop them when they'd carry them down the street and lynch them. They're the same kind of things. They're, I would say, not trying to be racist, there are Hispanic neighborhoods here in Texas that I just have no business being in, and they don't want me there. There are towns in the United States that are like 98% Muslim, and they have prayers coming out through the radar, through the air raid sirens in the morning. And the overall feeling is that because you have so many different competing cultures, and because some cultures don't care about might is right and talking things out, some will just go and slaughter, that it is nice to actually be able to protect yourself, to have that as an option. It's a rare option, but that's one of the reasons. We're moving down the list toward less important things, if you haven't noticed. The further down the list we go, the more ridiculous the reasons get for owning guns. We have 2 more left. Number 1 is that hunting is a major pastime here in the United States because of the frontier culture. We all hunt. We hunt a lot. We hunt various different things. If it moves, if it walks, if it can be killed, chances are we probably hunt that thing. And there are hunters in just about every state. If you were to ban guns or remove guns, it would probably displace a lot of hunters, give a lot of lower income citizens a lot more free time for them to get bored and do bad things, which wouldn't be very good. Lastly, we have sports shooting. There are some minor aspects of sports shooting, which I believe warrant gun ownership. But you see this in other countries too. I mean, even countries with stricter gun laws like Korea and United Kingdom, they still have sports shooters. They have people that get special permission to own guns so they can train to compete in the Olympics or special shooting or train SWAT teams and that sort of thing. So even if there was a firearms ban, I don't believe that would really affect that. Anyway, I hope that you all enjoy the commentary. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you learned some of the reasons that we own weapons here in the United States and some of the reasons that we don't want to give them away. In the next video, like I said, there's going to be a three-way discussion between myself, JX23, and Sergeant Merrill about reasons to increase gun control or perhaps ban weapons in general, because there are some good reasons and good arguments for that, and we're going to discuss those in the next episode. And then the one after that, we're going to be talking about the relationship between firearms and crime. As always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.